learning more about you, this is really interesting because going through your books, they feel very cinematic. It's not a screenplay that you're reading, but you can feel your direction. Like I can see a lot going on in my head as if it was a movie.
People have asked me a question like, process and all that. And for me, I see, and I'm sure other writers do as well, but I see the thing like a movie. I see it in my head. I'm often outside looking in, but with books, you also have that internal dialogue. And so my process, my journey as a person who was from the visual medium to this prose is that I see things visually, but I want to write them and export them poetically. And so I used to be pretty sparse in my, not in books, but in my stage directions in screenplays. I used to be like most writers. He opens the door, she kisses him on the cheek, blah, 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 blah. There's emotion. They look into each other's eyes, da, da, da. That kind of thing. My screenplays now, a lot more depth to them. I'm writing for the people reading so that they can see it. Those words will never get onto screen. The dialogue will, the visuals will. And I also always think that the relationship between me and a reader is that I'm the writer and something of the director, but they're the director. They direct the movie in their head. And when you do things with an audiobook narrator, right, you then are working with an actor, which I've always been very used to. So I wasn't afraid of hearing people say my words in ways that maybe I didn't think of them, because I've heard that 1,000 times before. And so there's me, and then there's the interpretation by the actor performing the work. And then there's the listener coming in. The books stand on their own if you read them, but they're also like so amazing in a completely different, not completely different, but in a new and an enhanced way when you listen to it. But first Will and now Ray, these actors have delivered things that I could not have imagined was in the text. I would only hope it was in the text, and I would hope that people would get it. But there's even some things that are kind of beautiful that and surprising to me. But Ray Porter is the guy who is he's in my Audible library the most of any person, of any narrator. He is in there way before he ever came on board with this. Ray has been, from the time Ray did the 4-Hour Work Week in the late 2000s. I don't know when it was exactly. I was like, who is this person? And his work with Peter Clines, and his work with Jonathan Mayberry, and his work with Project Hail Mary, and with the, We Are Bob series. I mean, We Are Bob, We Are Legion. Both he and Dennis, the author, I mean, they just created an amazing work that is a symbiotic relationship between the two of them. And so I was very, very, very glad when we were able to get Ray. And because of getting Ray, because there was going to be a time gap, it actually allowed me to go in and do something I don't always get to do, which is once the book was locked, I got to unlock it and add about another 10,000 words. It wasn't that the original ending of this third book was wrong. It wasn't as right as the ending is currently. And I was able to have a month to see that. And 2 weeks before we were going into the studio, I had an epiphany and just went crazy and realized that I had not fully delivered the promise of the premise. And I went back and delivered the promise of the premise.
So I've just dipped a toe into the new book, but I also went back and re-listened to the first two books. So where did the premise come from for Alexander X? Let's talk about that for people that are coming in new.
So the premise came from, there was this idea that I had for a screenplay. It was basically about this character who lived for 200 years. They lived for about 200 years. They looked like they were about 30, and they just were really good at a lot of different things. But I thought, well, if 200 years is interesting, what if they were like 2,000 years old? So I thought, well, what if they were older and they had a lot of skills, or they could learn a lot of skills? They weren't necessarily geniuses, like they weren't the Da Vinci's of the world, but they just were very, 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 very good at mastering things.
Mhm.
And they could die. So they were mortal. So they had that fear in them, and they had that limitation on them. And then what would happen if we follow this one character who's 1,500 years old, who looks like he's maybe 17, and he's been doing this for a while? And what if those other people, the people that are 4,000 years old, 5,000 years old, who have been kings and queens and generals and controlled large swaths of the entire planet, could no longer be famous anymore? They couldn't do what they've done for thousands and thousands of years. To them, it's like it's a year and a half.
Right.
To them, the last 150 years feels like a year and a half.
Right.
But for a year and a half, they've been locked down in quarantine. And, this happened before the quarantine, of course, but I think we all know how we felt when we were locked down. We didn't like it. And so what would happen if those people decided the only way to fix their problem was to take out the modern world?
Are you a historian by nature? Was this like a passion project in that regard? Because did you already know a lot of this stuff and you just wanted to bring some of these stories to light?
Some of this I knew. So Jeff, part of the thing is that I'm not a historian, but I'm fascinated by history.
Okay.
And I'm also fascinated by not just history, but how history is manipulated by everyone.
Yeah.
And it's used as a weapon. There are stories that are told about history that are not fully true. And it's hard to tell, like, because everything's been so rewritten. It's like a record that's been scratched a number of times, back and forth and back and forth. You kind of can dig deep and see what might be there, but it's hard. And one of the things for me was to go back and look at some things that I found, which were surprising to me that I didn't know, or things along the way that I'd learned that went, this is weird, that this is the truth. Like July 2nd, July 4th is really July 2nd. The Wright brothers weren't the first person to fly a plane,
Right. Okay. Wait, stop right there. Cause that was one where I was like, what a strange story this is. And I can't remember his first name. It was Whitehead was the guy's name.
Gustav Whitehead.
And I'm like, I don't know where he's getting this stuff, but I Googled it. I was like, what if? And it turns out there was a guy that was doing flight before the Wright brothers.
And a lot longer and better.
And, right. And that's amazing. Why have I never heard of this guy? And you kind of tell a sad story in that regard. I haven't fact checked all of everything you cite in your books by any means, but I've looked up a few things here and there. I'm like, wow, look at that. Oh, look at that. Oh, look at that. Gustav Whitehead or Peter Minuit, some of these things that you wind up mentioning in your books. And you're teaching me some fascinating stuff, I guess. And was that always part of your idea for when you started writing these books, and how much time do you spend researching this stuff?
So I spent a lot of time researching some of the things. What was important to me, like, again, since this was really kind of like I said, a love letter to my teenagers at the time, I wanted to say, hey, I've had this relationship with education where education is a great thing. It's wonderful. I ended up learning many, many more things outside of the world of school because I was curious. So you have to be curious when you're in school. If it's just about regurgitating facts, it's not going to be great. And so my thing has always been, hey, here's some facts that you may learn, and it may be someone told you this, but this isn't exactly true. So look a little bit deeper. So all of those things are based, in fact, I try to be as factual about everything.
Alongside the history stuff, this is something that I just kept thinking about again and again. You have, so there's plenty of action scenes in these books. Eternals get into fights with each other or other
Couple, one or
forces.
two. Yeah.
There's chase scenes, there's fight scenes, there's also explosions,
Yep.
gunplay. It's all extremely detailed. Again, paints a very vivid picture in my head as I'm reading or listening to it. In the same way, I'm wondering if you're a historian, like, have you studied a lot of this stuff, or is this just a lifetime of watching action movies, or where does the research come in for your?
It's living action movies. So there was a very funny thing. Someone asked me a question, and I'm actually going to do a video about this, about some of the writing process, right? So I'm starting my marketing people have always said, hey, listen, start talking about your process, because your process is kind of weird. Like, I mean, every writer has their own thing, but I have some weird stuff that goes on. Like
Okay.
you know, I walk around doing some scenes. So I write 3 different ways. I write like everybody writes, like, I do it old school. I also write on digital pads where I'm writing notes, and also redlining PDFs of current, first drafts or second or third or fifth or 10th drafts of something, where I'm handwriting, non-destructive editing, which is really important for writers. Like, you got to learn how to do non-destructive editing, where you're literally redlining over the top of stuff that exists, because you can do anything then. You could make any kind of change, and then later on you might not put it in. But when you put it into the document, when you're typing, it changes it. And yeah, you can hit undo, but you can't really make a judgment on it. Like when you look at it from 1,000, like looking at it from 10,000 feet.
Absolutely.
And the other way that I write, it's never final. Sidney Sheldon and all these other guys used to literally dictate stuff, and their assistants would transcribe it.
Yeah.
But I use voice recognition. And so I have my Beyonce mic, and I walk around with my Beyonce mic and my audio pack that's hooked to my computer. That's usually like, I got a big giant 65-inch screen is one of the screens, and it's like 20 feet away from me, and I'm walking around pacing, and I'm doing the actions where I'm like going up against the wall with a gun, or I'm limping, and I'm describing what I'm feeling and seeing. Like, what is my character thinking? And my neighbors, those who can see in my windows, must think I'm an absolute crazy person, because I'm talking to myself, and I'm shadowboxing and fighting with myself in the middle of a room. So some of those moments are at least influenced by me walking around with a digital recorder or doing it live into the dictation, where I'm just actually working out the moment. And the hardest thing to do is to write an action sequence, because good dialogue is easy for me. I'm a screenwriter. I love dialogue. Kind of wordplay is fun and interesting, and playing on sentence structure is fun. I really get into that. I like digging my teeth into the language. But writing an action sequence in a movie, you can take 3 seconds on a screen, or 2 seconds, or a half a second to describe or to see or to show a close-up of something, and give the audience a piece of information that you can't do eloquently in a book. And so I went and I was like, who are the best that ever have done this? And I would have to say that the best that ever did it was Alexander Dumas. And so, Count of Monte Cristo, Three Musketeers, and the sequels to Three Musketeers, like, you read those books, and that's the best action description, because you're not telling the action always. It may feel like you're seeing every move, but what you're actually telling is the feeling of what you're feeling while that action is happening, while your reaction to the action is what you're actually describing. So, because it would get really boring, I think, if you were just saying, he hit him on the head, and then he walked 3 paces and turned around and swung this. And people would be just like, oh, yeah, wake me. The idea is that you have to break those up. Like, when I'm telling you the fight, da, 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 da. Oh, by the way, here's this little tiny detail right here. I'm going to stop. I'm going to slow the action down, and I'm going to elongate that for just a second as I tell you this piece of trivia or this piece of physics. And then I'm going to boom, jump back in, because if I stayed too long in there, it would be boring. Right. And so there's people that can agree or disagree with whether or not I go too long or too short on that, but those are my choices. And the people like you who have really responded to this, I think we enjoy those things when writers take those moments and have the da 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 da. If that makes any sense to write.
It does to me, yes.
By the way, I'm going to take when you give me this, I'm going to take a clip of that of me doing da 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 da, and just post that because that will look. Oh, yeah, that's going to look good. Yeah, here's my writing advice. Here's my writing advice.
The first book takes place entirely in Boston or the surrounding area. You did a lot of damage to Boston. Were you working out some issues?
It's funny. I mean, I do not dislike Boston. San Francisco and Boston, two of my favorite places. I'm fans of the sports teams in those cities as well. I also am very, very intentional about, I don't like to just let's not just always blow up the Washington Monument and always blow up the White House. But there were just some places that just needed to go a little bit. And without giving away any spoilers or anything, what happens in the first book, the moment where there's this first explosion in the book, it shows the lengths that people who live thousands of years go to make sure that they're not discovered,
Yes, indeed. And still some mysteries, at least as we go into book 3, following explosions and chases and a bunch of things that happened during the first 2 books.
Yep.
Paris, you weren't especially kind to Paris in the second book.
And another of my favorite cities. I love Paris.
It's a lovely city.
They're love letters with bombs is what they are. They're package bombs sent with a love letter.
I would like to end with one question that to me, the answer seems super obvious, but I wind up hearing surprising answers from lots of other people, and it does tie into your books. If you could, would you want immortality?
There's a quote at the beginning of the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's by an actor in the Twilight series, and Alex Mraz. And basically he says, I would not want to be immortal forever. And I think it's a great quote. But I agree with your premise. Jeff. I think if I gave you my honest personal answer, of course, I'd want to live for as long as I could. I think it would. I think we would get a bit annoyed with each other.
All right. Last thing I'm going to say is that I said this 3.5 years ago when I was like this much invested into what you were making. And now it's like, because it blew up on me and I love it so much. This should be a TV series. I feel like it just, you could almost just film what you wrote. And I really hope that someone's listening, because surely someone's listening.
Remember, I'm a screenwriter first. And
I wasn't even thinking about that 3.5 years ago, but now you're putting all these ideas in my head. So
I think it would be kind of a fun experience to take this to that next level. And
when it happens, I'd love to come for a set visit and see how things are going.
You would definitely be invited. Definitely come.